Hello, it is I, Dr. Brian Lorgon111, and welcome back to more videos about Z-Tracker. In the previous videos, I've talked about various features of the Zelda 1 randomizer tracker, and today I want to talk more about the history of the tracker. Design is an iterative process, and while I did not capture a ton of information about the past of how this tool has looked and evolved over time, I do have a number of old screenshots and just want to kind of talk through some of the process. One of the most valuable things that has helped me out is having someone to bounce ideas off of. I mentioned in the previous video Mark. Mark is my only Linux tester, was the motivation for porting this whole thing to Linux. But as a result, he's been very helpful. We've had kind of almost daily kind of design discussions about different aspects of the tool, and he has given a ton of feedback, way more than any of my other testers who have gotten kind of advanced copies of the tracker to give feedback and help find bugs and things like that. And so it's been very useful to have someone else who also has design sense to kind of just have a back and forth discussion about, like, what if we tried this and what if it looked like this, just to get kind of feedback and consider a bunch of different options. And so I want to give a shout out, give some credit to Mark. Mark Megas. I'll probably link him in the comments or in the description of this video. But in any case, let's go through some old screenshots and kind of compare how things used to look versus how they look today. So one old screenshot I found is a full screenshot of the app that I'll probably put on the screen now, and I'll probably break it down to kind of like looking at different sections. In the overworld section, for example, you will notice that the grayed out areas have X's on them as well, which makes the whole interface look a whole lot noisier in terms of just like there's a whole bunch of X's that kind of like catch your eye. The various dungeon icons have these kind of bars around the corner of the rectangle that just add a bunch of visual noise, and the same with kind of the any road locations. The various icons for other map tiles, like shops, potion shop or a blue ring shop, have these kind of enormous icons that either take up all or a good portion of the tile, whereas nowadays things have kind of much thinner icons. There's probably some other differences here. I'm just looking at the old screenshot on my screen right now or whatever, but you can see how the tool evolved over time to have both kind of just a generally cleaner look as well as icons that weren't as noisy and didn't disrupt the ability to look at the overworld navigation overall as much as the old versions did. And so that kind of shows kind of a general evolution of kind of the iconography of the overworld. I should mention, by the way, when I was talking about Mark before, in addition to just being a tester, he's also done a little bit of coding on the Linux version, as well as helped out with some of the pixel art with icons and stuff with the overworld map, etc. Has a good eye for color and stuff like that. And so he's been a contributor to the project as well. You can see him on the GitHub history for the project. So yeah, that's kind of an overworld comparison, and just looking back at the current app again, just to compare, like a potion shop currently looks like this, and a key shop or a blue ring shop look like this, and so the icons are thinner and cleaner, and when you mark off squares, they just go dark rather than having X's on them. And the various dungeons, do I have reminders turned off? Let's go ahead and stop all the reminders so we don't have to listen to the talking. The dungeons have nice clean icons that look like that now. And so there's just less visual clutter, which is good because when the map gets filled, it can feel very cluttered in terms of all the icons that are on the screen. So another huge change that you'll see in the old screenshot is the timeline, which used to take up like 3 full lines. It was kind of more than twice as much space and ended up being very non-densely packed. Because I hadn't come up with a good way to display the timeline for like up to 3 hours and kind of cramming the icons together so that they wouldn't overlap. It's much more difficult to read the old style timeline. I think we saw kind of in the previous video a bit of what the newer timeline looks like. Unless I populate a bunch of items on the timeline over a long period of time, it'll be hard to put it together quickly for this video. Something else from the old screenshot you'll see is kind of the very primitive version of the dungeon tracker. In that version, it looked like I had like just a few different room choices you could choose from, which were like completed room, unmarked, which would be an uncompleted room, some chutes for rooms that had special geometry for horizontal or vertical that you could go through, a couple of special room markers, which were a red room and a yellow room that you could choose to use however you like. And as for doors, there were just green squares and red squares, where green was a doorway you could go through, and red was a wall that you couldn't bomb through. And so it's quite the difference compared to today. And so just to compare, I tried to draw kind of the same dungeon map using today's icons just to show how it's both richer in terms of showing the topology, in terms of the red red squares for doors that you couldn't go through, which are now kind of like walls that you can't bomb through that are much more clear on the tracker, as well as being able to mark up like a specific boss as opposed to just a red box, etc. And if we take a look at the notes in that old screenshot, 6 key, 7 weapon, mags, DM, those were all things that are now captured in blockers and hints. And so today I would be able to say that 6 is key blocked in order to put it there, or that 7 was combat blocked. I need a better weapon in order to do things in 7. Or if I find out that the magical sword is on Death Mountain from an NPC hint, I would be able to mark it up as magical sword on Death Mountain. And then be able to look up that hint in order to find out where I need to look in order to try to find the magical sword at some point in the future. So an example of a lot of the things that I used to keep in textual notes being reified into actual features of the tracker. I found a screenshot of an early version of the start screen, where basically all you could do was choose your dungeon quest, and rather than being an options menu, there were just a couple of options for whether you wanted the voice reminders, speech synthesis, and voice recognition, the speech recognition turned on. It also was the case that there wasn't a way to click on the start spot and then click on the map in order to place it. There wasn't a button in the app to reset the timer, and so both of those, rather than having any kind of remappable keys, it was just hard bound to F5 and F10 in order to do those actions at the start. So it used to be a very simple start screen. In contrast, you can see the current start screen, which has a couple of different startup options, still selecting the particular quest of overworld that you want in order to start the game. It also shows a random tip. I've got, I don't know, a few dozen tips for skill levels, different skill levels of play in order to help you kind of learn about Zelda 1 Randomizer. And there's also tips about Z-Tracker itself, so you can learn some features of the app if you don't know it. And then there's a whole bunch of settings in the options menu that show up on the start screen as well, so you can set up some options before you get started. I found an old screenshot of an early version of the magnifier. This was not the earliest version of the magnifier, but it shows that it used to not capture the kind of like diagonal corner blocks that appear on the overworld, and so it looks a whole lot blockier. I've got the same version now up in the main app, and so you can kind of compare how these two screens look. It also used different colors. I was originally just kind of like borrowing all the same colors that were in the Z Helper application, and those have recently been updated to be colors that I think make more sense. Cyan is now for bombing because it's kind of a blue color and the bombs are blue, whereas the yellow is now for whistle spots since the recorder is kind of a yellowish color, just as for example. And in the magnifier now, it's the case that the entrances kind of pop a little bit more. They've got kind of a black border around the various colored pixels, so they really kind of jump out at you in the magnifier these days. And showing those diagonal corner icons really does help. For example, on a screen like this, the entrance is just to the right of a couple of the diagonal corners that appear on the overworld map. And before those were there, it just looked like a long flat wall, and so you'd have to like count off that you need to bomb 6 squares from the left of the screen in order to be in the right spot. Whereas once I added the diagonal corners, you could see it was right to the right of the indentation where you need to bomb on the particular screen that my mouse has highlighted right now. Originally, Z-Tracker didn't have anything to do with hints, and Mark was asking me about, the Aqua necessitates. And I was like, you can pull up a table to find out that Aqua necessitates means level 1 and Gleoclerx means level 4. And so he found a table of that on the web somewhere. And it turns out the table was slightly out of date. There's Gluyak Lurks and there's Gluyak Returns for level 4 and for level 8. And I think it might have said like Gluyak Creeps or something on the webpage, which is out of date and doesn't correspond to either of them. Um, and so when I discovered that the web page was out of date, I went ahead and just made the decoder. And so you're seeing an old screenshot of the original hint decoder page, which was just something that you would hover over in the app and it would pop up a little window showing you kind of like the hint decoder smarts. And so originally there was nothing, and then I added the little pop-up that you could hover just to read them. And then eventually I ended up encoding the information as we saw before. And so if I do it again in the app, if, for example, the magical sword is located at the grave, now in addition to actually storing the hint, now we have the hint hover highlights where I can hover over the magical sword. It shows me the grave area and it shows me all the locations that I can go to there. And so I do also have another screenshot from back when I was first working on kind of like displaying the hint decoding that I can put up now. And we can compare these two. And yeah, in the old screenshot, it didn't darken the rest of the map and it was showing all the areas, but just putting the name of the one area that you were in. And this was before I had the green, yellow, red rectangle highlights. I think this was before I even knew that there was a differentiation between green and yellow, because I played this game for over 2 years and didn't realize that some spots always yield a location and other spots don't. Because Z Helper never surfaced that information, and so I had no idea. And so once again, the tracker helps you learn important features about the randomizer, and so Z Tracker is doing that now by differentiating between green screens and yellow screens, screens that always yield a location and screens that only sometimes do. But yeah, you can kind of like see the difference in terms of how much it's visually giving the player information about the zone and where they should look and what items or what locations they can get to right now versus what locations they'll need to get new items to get in the future, versus the old one that was just like, here's the screens it could possibly be on, and they're highlighted very ugly with a green overcast of the whole thing that kind of obscures a bit of the navigation. And so this is something that evolved quite a bit over time in order to look differently, and I think a whole lot better now. Switching gears for a bit, I want to talk about just kind of the size of the project. Lines of code is not necessarily the best metric for measuring the size of a project, but it's better than nothing. And so I was just taking a look today at how many lines of code this thing is. It's kind of factored into a model and a view. We've got model code and UI code. There's about 1,800 lines of code in the model. In addition to that, there's about 1,200 lines of data code, and I'll talk about what that is in a little bit. And then in the UI, there's about 8,300 lines of code. And then in addition to all the actual code, there's also about 800 lines of documentation, because basically there's kind of like web documentation to kind of walk you through how to use all the features of Z-Tracker. And so all put together, that's like on the order of 12,000 lines that I have written. And so that at least gives a sense of the size of the project. And I talked also in the past about how this was a project that I started a while back, a couple of years ago, and had done little bits and pieces of work on it over a couple bits of time, but most of it happened in the last 3 months. And so I was just taking on a look at GitHub, which is where the source code lives, and the source code frequency. And so I'm going to put up a screenshot of the graph of that, and you can see that basically almost all of the activity has been in the last 3 months. Adding and changing the code as things have gone on. So you can see basically there was a bit of work on the project way back at the beginning, and then I had another spike where I was doing some stuff on my own. But then when I started porting things to Avalonia for Linux so that Mark could get on board and use things, and then really started working on it over the last 3 months, that's where all the activity in this code base has been. So I talked about data code. And what I mean by that, I'm going to just like show some bits of code on the screen, which is, it's not the most efficient way to store the data, but it works just fine and it's nice and readable. But for example, the overworld map zones, for example, when I hover over zones inside the tracker and it shows you this kind of zone, you can see on the left-hand side, like the grave is this kind of pointy one that we've taken a look at today. And there's code that basically just has a bunch of strings, which are kind of the layout of the overworld, and a capital G stands for the grave zone. And so that's how I have just kind of organized how the zones are laid out. Inside the tracker, I can hover Armos, and there's 5 different Armos screens. And the way that the tracker knows that data is this Armos array, which is just a bunch of strings again, where almost all the entries are dots, except for there's a few that are X's, which are basically the location of the Armos screens. And so there's a bunch of kind of data about the map and the tracker that's kind of stored in these kind of readable arrays and different things like this. And so when I said there was 1,200 lines of data code, it's stuff along these lines that I'm just encoding in code, but it's actually kind of raw data that I could have encoded another way. And then finally, to get really wonky, I wanted to show a little bit of the code, like when you're on an overworld tile, and if you left click it or right click it to bring up the pop-up, or scroll the mouse wheel, or press a hotkey when you're on a tile. I just wanted to show the code that's kind of like at least the master code that's kind of like handling all of those actions. So I'm going to put a screenshot of that up on the screen. And yeah, there's just one aspect in particular, like a lot of people won't know what's going on here, and maybe you can get kind of a general gist by just kind of trying to read some of what's going on here. But for those who are programmers who have worked with some UI code before, the noteworthy line that's kind of highlighted in the middle is kind of the interesting one. You'll recall that if I have a shop and I left click on the shop, I can put a second icon in the shop. So you could have 2 different items. You could have a shop that sells both bombs and arrows, for example. And the way that I handled that is, when you left click on the shop, it puts up another pop-up. And I had seen some idioms in some other Windows WPF code that was using async in order to do modal pop-up windows. And the pop-ups that I have in my code are not, they're modal logically, because basically when the pop-up is there, like all you can do is interact with the pop-up or click outside of it in order to like cancel the pop-up. So it's logically modal from the point of view of the application, but from the point of view of the window manager, it's not modal at all. My pop-ups are just drawing new UI elements on the screen that you can interact with. But nevertheless, I'm using the same kind of asynchronous pattern in order to do that. And so do left click is the thing that handles left clicking on different tiles. And so we talked about, for example, if there's a secret, you can left click on it and it toggles the brightness of the tile. And so that's something that's just kind of like making a state change and then redrawing the UI to be a different brightness. But if you left click on a shop, then it puts up this whole modal dialogue, and it could be that the user is going to be interacting for 5 or 10 seconds with that dialogue before it goes away, and you continue with the rest of the code. And so I'm using an F# async pattern in order to do that. But I haven't thought deeply about, since the window manager like doesn't know anything with the modality here or whatever, like the window manager and its message pump I know can be re-entrant, and the F# asynchronous stuff with the trampoline can also potentially be re-entrant, and I haven't thought about if and how they interact very deeply. But in practice, it has not caused me any problems, so I think it just works the way that I've written stuff like this, and it's extremely convenient, and it makes it extremely straightforward to write the code that I'm writing. It took me quite a bit of time, actually, to kind of like land in some of these patterns, but as a result, it makes the UI code pretty easy to read and understand if you kind of like know what's going on with all of this stuff. So I just wanted to kind of talk about that in passing for the very few people in the audience who might be interested in such things. So yeah, let's change gears again and talk about just kind of other aspects of iterative design. I talked about how in the current UI, it's very nice because the simple things are simple. If you just want to mark up rooms and some are complete and some aren't complete, you just left click. And then when you want to go deeper, you right click and it gives you the pop-up where you can select the room types, and you can either left click on that when you're done, or you could even right click on one of these guys and go even deeper into the UI and start setting up some other bits and pieces of stuff that you might want to put in the dungeon room decorations. And that was a great UI. It was not always like this. Once upon a time, it was the case that if you left click on a room, it would be an uncompleted room. And if you right clicked on a room, it would be, or sorry, if you left click on a room, it would be a completed room. And if you right clicked on a room, it would be incomplete. But then I needed a way to pop up the UI to select the different room types. And so the way that I ended up doing it was anytime you clicked on a room, it would pop up the UI, but it would wait for 500 milliseconds before you did. And so if you didn't care about changing the room type, you could double click on a room very quickly. And it would just, double left click would mark it as an uncompleted room, or double right click would mark it as, or a completed room, and double right click would mark it as an uncompleted room without actually activating the pop-up. But if you just clicked once and then waited a short period of time, it would automatically pop up. And I mean, it was usable, but it was not nearly as good as the current UI. It was unintuitive, and sometimes you wouldn't click fast enough, and you had to wait for the pop-up to come up, and it was bad. I don't remember how I ended up kind of landing there, but basically there was a bunch of things that I needed to cram into just a couple of mouse buttons, and I didn't originally have the best way to go. And so that's another thing that the dungeon rooms, in addition to just kind of like the layered UI, where you can go into the second layer and kind of like add this extra stuff, which came very late in the overall design. Just kind of like the early design had to be iterated in terms of like what buttons you click in order to do some of the common actions versus bring up the pop-ups. At this point in time, I have, I think, maybe 9 people who have private copies of the beta. This is currently in private beta at the time that I'm recording this. And beta testers give lots of good feedback and also find bugs that you wouldn't normally find on your own. And so I just wanted to talk about a couple of those bugs because I think people will find them interesting. One is right after I added hotkeys, one of the first people that I gave Z-Tracker to was trying out Z-Tracker, and they were just setting things up right at the very beginning. And they were starting to just like set up their stream or whatever. And so like I could see Z-Tracker on the stream, and it was great. They might have typed something as just kind of a friendly message in the notes box or something, and they were doing something else. And then all of a sudden the app crashed. And I was like, no, because I had not seen the app crash that way. And fortunately, I have included a crash log. And so when the app crashes, it puts a bunch of diagnostic data in a log file. And so I was able to have the person send me the log file. And I took a look at it and was able to figure out what was going on, which is, as you know, there are hotkeys. So if I'm over a tile in the overworld and I press B, it does one thing. If I'm over something in the inventory and I press B, it does a different thing. If I'm inside the dungeon layout and I press B, it's going to do a different thing. If I'm inside the blockers and I press B, it's going to do a different thing because I have a map to bombs and bow and bomb shop in different places. Oh, wow. And my text box still has focus, it looks like. And so I was getting all the bees in the text box. You can click outside of the text box in order to fix that. And now I can click different blockers and the bees won't go in there. That was also something that the text box, getting rid of the text box focus, was something that one of my beta testers asked about. Yeah, so basically, depending upon where your mouse is, it figures out how to process keystrokes and hotkeys. And so what this tester did that crashed the app was they moved the mouse outside of the application and they pressed a button on the keyboard, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And it crashed because my code was saying, what is the mouse currently hovering? And send a key to that thing. And when you move your mouse outside of the application, it's hovering nothing. And so you get back a null reference. And then I was trying to call a method on the null reference, which crashed the app. Yeah, and, it's a thing that someone can totally do. And in the course of my own testing, I just never found it because I was always interacting with the app and my mouse was always here and here and here and here when I was testing. never even thought to move the mouse outside of the app. So that was an easy bug to fix, but was just not the type of thing that I was going to discover on my own. So that's why you have beta testers. Another example of a bug from a beta tester that was great is one of my beta testers is from Norway. And the very first time they tried to start up Z-Tracker, it crashed on the start screen. And once again, I took a look at the crash logs. And as you know, as we've seen in a previous video, one of the features is speech recognition, which can, I can say, I don't have it hooked up right now, but I could say tracker set bomb shop, and it would automatically mark the current tile as a bomb shop. I don't know a whole lot about how Windows speech recognition stuff is built in, but as you might imagine, it is language specific. And the person in Norway had a Norwegian version of Windows installed, and so it turns out some of my speech recognition initialization code was failing at startup when it was trying to do something with setting up speech recognition grammars, I guess in English, on a Norwegian version of Windows or something along those lines. Once again, it was an easy problem to solve once I knew that it was a problem, but it was not something I was going to find in my own testing. And so another great example of why you have beta testers and why I currently just have a few private copies handed out to people to help me find bugs like this before I make a public release. Because, yeah, I think it's important to have a good public release where people have a good first experience and don't have the app crash on them at the beginning or while they're in the middle of the game, because that would be very disappointing and leave a bad taste in their mouth. They might not want to use the app in the future. So, yeah, finding these bugs early. One more very interesting thing, I think, in terms of the design of the UI that I kind of alluded to before with modal pop-ups. You'll recall, perhaps, in Z-Helper, that if I want to mark this as Dungeon 4, I could just use the scroll wheel to scroll over to Dungeon 4, and there's no pop-ups in Z-Helper, and so basically you would just, start from unmarked and go to Dungeon 1, Dungeon 2, Dungeon 3, Dungeon 4, and then you could move your mouse away and it would stay at Dungeon 4. In Z-Tracker, you need to select Dungeon 4 from the pop-up either by clicking on it, or after scrolling, you can also just click on the tile with your mouse in order to kind of like lock in that choice. And that was an intentional design decision because one of the things I noticed after I was, I don't know, a month or two into the final 3 months of coding where everything was really kind of coming together, I realized I had a huge problem, which was, for example, I'm not going to turn them on right now, but from the reminders, like if you find Dungeon 1, you've now found 1 dungeon. If you find Dungeon 2, you've now found 2 dungeons, etc., etc. And so if it was the case that merely scrolling automatically moved to the next tile as the overworld mark without having to do any other interaction in order to kind of commit to that choice, then it would be the case that if you found Dungeon 9, as far as the app was concerned, it was like, congratulations, you found Dungeon 1. Congratulations, you found Dungeon 2. Congratulations, you found Dungeon 3. ... until you found Dungeon 9. Because the act of scrolling, you kind of transition through all of the states along the way in order to get there. And that would have been a problem. The same kind of thing in terms of if someone was choosing to use the scroll wheel and was about to get the raft along the way, if it was working more in the Z-Helper fashion where there wasn't a pop-up, it would be like, you got the book, you got the boomerang, you got the power bracelet, you got the ladder, you got the boomerang, you got the key, you got the raft. And then it would finally just land in that state where you got the raft. But along the way, there would be all of those wrong inferences because the player was not trying to mark the square as they have the ladder. They were simply in the process of scrolling past it. But in the kind of non-modal UI that Z-Helper has, the act of scrolling past a thing is no different from scrolling to the thing. And so Originally, I was thinking about different ways to account for that that would just still let the player just scroll and not have to make any other interactions. And I was like, well, if you're scrolling down through a thing, like maybe I could just wait and say if the player hasn't hit the scroll wheel in the last, 3 seconds or something, then they've committed to the choice. And something like that could work. And so I actually ran with something along those lines in the UI, and so it didn't have the modal pop up, and you could just scroll, and then once the UI had seen that you stopped scrolling for like a few seconds, then it would go ahead and say, okay, let's lock in that choice. Let's go recompute some data. If we need to send some new reminders based on the new state of the player's inventory, let's do all that kind of stuff, etc. And it looked like it might work. And then I was watching how some people use Z-Helper in practice, because once again, in addition to my own beta testers for Z-Tracker, I was spending a lot of time doing reconnaissance work of watching how people use the existing tracker, Z-Helper. And I was horrified to discover that not infrequently in Z-Helper, people will, let's suppose I just got the silver arrows. They would start scrolling over to the silver arrows, but at the same time, they would be doing this with their right hand, and their left hand would be on the controller, and they would walk over to the next screen, and oh no, there's a Wizrobe on that screen, and I need to fight him. And so they would take their hand off the mouse, put their hand on the controller, and start fighting the Wizrobe. Meanwhile, Z-Helper has broadcast that they now have the ladder, when in fact they don't have the ladder. They were just in the midst of scrolling and got interrupted. And then after fighting monsters on that screen, they might go back to then continuing to scroll and finally get to their final destination of the silver arrow or something like that. And the same kind of thing when people were marking up particular overworld tiles. They might scroll halfway to getting to where they were, and then all of a sudden have to fight some monsters on the screen, and then go back to scrolling and finish updating the thing. And so that's a real problem for a tracker that's trying to get semantic information from the user's inputs, because if the inputs are not reliable, if the inputs instead are just part of a transitional phase, then you have a problem. And so the solution to that problem was to make these modal pop-ups, where basically once the pop-up comes up, you're in a mode, and from inside that mode, you can either select a particular item by clicking on it in order to dismiss the pop-up and actually make a change to the UI, or while you're in the pop-up, no changes have actually happened to the UI. And so if I'm here in the ladder, the tracker doesn't think we have the ladder. It just knows we're in a pop-up where we're considering marking the ladder right now. And for example, I could move the mouse out here and click out here and just dismiss the pop-up and nothing changes, because even if I do that, for example, I started here on the red candle. Maybe I start making a change, and I'm like, wait a minute, this isn't the box I meant to edit. If I move my mouse out of this area, it just snaps back to the original state. So it just popped right back to the red candle. And so if I click outside the pop-up, it just goes back to the original state. So basically, nothing has actually changed in the application state while you're in the pop-up. These are just kind of like temporary state for consideration, and it's not until you actually click on a final choice that then it gets sent to the app, and the app starts doing all of its updates in terms of computing, stuff for how many dungeons have you found? Do you need a reminder? Did you just find a new piece of inventory like the ladder that's going to cause a whole bunch of update stuff to change, such as where's nearby and are you able to walk across the river, which is going to change a whole lot of the nearby tiles and all those types of things. So that was a long-winded way of saying the modal pop-ups are extremely intentional as a way to accurately capture the user's intentions in terms of changing the application state without letting their intermediate actions along the way of getting to that state change incorrectly inform the app about the state of the world. All right. So yeah, that was a big deal in terms of me figuring out kind of just the whole overarching design principles that the UI needed in order to support all of these nice features like reminders and the rich UI that happens with the pop-ups and knowing about the player's inventory in order to be able to show what locations that they can get to on the overworld, etc. I just noticed while I was marking this dungeon, I'm currently on dungeon 7, if I were to find dungeon 3 and click on it, it automatically changes the tab to dungeon 3 down here. So if you just found a dungeon, like typically the thing you do is you walk in, and so rather than have the player have to go and change the dungeon tab, it automatically does that. It's just a nice convenience for the player. And I don't think I had ever talked about that in a previous video, and so I'm just pointing it out right now, since I happen to notice it. But I think I've rambled enough for today, and possibly I've rambled enough to describe all the things I wanted to talk about in terms of the tracker, in terms of what it does, in terms of its features and capabilities, a bit about its history, a bit about how it was implemented. So there may or may not be another video in this series, depending upon if I come up with other things I want to talk about. I think I will make more videos about the tracker in the future because I want to make some kind of quick start videos to help people learn how to use the tracker when it has a public release, but we're not there yet, so that'll be probably at some point in the future. But yeah, I'm done for this video for today, so I will say I hope as always that you all are having a great day, and I'll see you again soon.